and welcome to The Child and Its Enemies, a podcast about queer and neurodivergent kids living out anarchy and youth liberation. Here at The Child and Its Enemies, we believe that youth autonomy is not only crucial to queer and trans liberation, but to anarchy itself. Governance is inherently based on projecting linear narratives of time and development and gender onto our necessarily asynchronous and atemporal queer lives, and youth and teens are at the center of this form of oppression. Our goal with the podcast is to create a space by and for youth that challenges all forms of control and inspires us to create weird, feral, ageless networks of care. I'm your host, MK Zariel. My pronouns are it/its. I'm 15 years old, and I'm the youth correspondent at the Anarchist Review of Books, author of the blog Debate Me Bro, and organizer for trans liberation in the Great Lakes region and beyond. With me today is Tom from the anarchist news site It's Going Down.
Hi, how y'all doing?
Doing okay. Still queer and trans, shockingly. So what exactly is It's Going Down? How did it start?
Yeah, so IGD has a really long backstory, and I think it's really relevant to what the project is today. So we run a news site, right? Like, we run an open publication news site. People send us stuff. We don't publish everything people send us. It's curated for sure. Some of the things we get submitted are interesting. Most of them are really, really great. And so we publish a lot of report backs. We do a lot of roundups on actions. We publish people's theoretical pieces. We will push days of action. This project really has its roots in the 2007, 2008 era, when a lot of us were circulating around kind of the insurrectionist scene, back around when the 2008 RNC happened and when the 2009 G20 happened. And out of that circle of people came a publication called Fire to the Prisons. Now, Fire to the Prisons was amazing. If people haven't seen copies of Fire to the Prisons, go look at them. It was way ahead of its time. It was like 10 years ahead of its time. And it stopped publishing, but out of the networks that built up out of that, IGD kind of emerged, right? The idea was that we had open publication sites before, right? There was infoshop.org way back in the day, like 20 years ago. Anarchist News, right, serves that role. Like, they publish everything. What we were missing, and what we kind of identified in the conversations that would ultimately lead to the project, is that we were missing a curated, focused news site where we could contact correspondents and have them go out and cover stuff and actually do journalism in like a functional way. The project has really evolved since then, and it's become something really different than that idea. But that's sort of where it starts. I mean, IGD is a small crew of people, but they're people who have known each other for a really long time and have this like deep level of trust with one another from years of street actions and things.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that. As someone who is influenced and got radicalized by the queer smash back tendency, I love that you're drawing on insurrectionary anarchism, and I love that you're drawing on the intersection with counter info. Like, I think especially for youth and teens, anarchist art and anarchist media can be the most accessible point of entry because, it doesn't require dealing with adult-dominated spaces. Anyone can create it. It can be pretty anonymous. And then you can find the confidence to enter those spaces. Like, I remember when I was 13, I just spent months of my life reading Emma Goldman and Voltairine de Cleyre. And then I was finally like, oh, I should join an affinity group. And I found my first affinity group, and it went from there. But yeah, thank you for speaking on that.
I mean, I was 16 when I got started in stuff in the late 1990s,
nice.
Right? And it was a very similar experience. Like, you went to leftist and Marxist spaces, and they were all dominated by adults with old school politics that were really sort of dusty and musty. And,
you weren't that aware of queerness and transness, I'm guessing.
Oh, not at all. I mean, like, at all. And I fell into this doing anti-racist action work, which in my part of the country was almost entirely anarchist related. And those were spaces I could just walk into at 16 years old and be completely accepted, totally fine, and be an active participant. It was really incredible. And you're right in saying I haven't seen that in any other political spaces, at least in the United States.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. Like, the idea that the organizing that we start with when it's explicitly anarchist, it really shapes us. But
Yeah.
yeah, that experience of exclusion from traditional leftist organizing, I think, is what draws so many, especially young trans anarchists, to the idea of post-leftism.
Oh, yeah.
Like, my generation is more into CrimethInc and other like post-leftist anarchist projects than
Yep.
any I've ever seen before, which is interesting on a middle school group chat, but can actually be really formative. So, getting really broad about what it means to create anarchist media, how do you define the idea of counter-info? Would you say that it's going down is in that sphere, or is it more journalistic? And what role would you say it plays in social movements?
Yeah, so IGD has a kind of really interesting relationship to counter-info sites in that it sort of emerges from that, right? But kind of exists in a slightly different location, I would say, in journalism. So while like a counter-info site is aimed at publicizing the unseen, right? Actions, communiques, people's meetings, talks, stuff like that. And doing that on a very local level, largely, like mostly. And that tendency really grew out of the indie media movement from the late 90s and sort of the need to have local radical media. But I think what's slightly different with the way we're doing things is I think we're curating more, but our scope is different, right? So our goal largely is to be a general entry point, right? So the way that someone once described this to me, and I love this, is like insurrectionary anarchism is a giant funnel, right? And it goes all the way down to the bottom, and you can like keep finding more and more and more people. But like where IGD exists is it exists at that top of that funnel as a way to get people into the funnel, right? And so we talked to the New York Times and we talked to the Washington Post. In 2020, we were a major source. So was CrimethInc for all manner of things. And it had a really major impact on the way that media discourse around the uprising played out. And so we play that role, which a lot of counter-info projects are pretty militantly resistant to for every good reason, right? We've just decided that we can play that role. So we do that. But what does that mean? Like, what does it mean for us to do anarchist media? We depart from a basic premise, which is that no media is, quote, neutral, right? All journalists have perspectives. Those perspectives work their way into the way that they understand the ideas that they're writing about, or the way that they understand and experience the events they're seeing. And even in that basic way, right? Like we're talking, your normal CNN journalist is a capitalist, right? That's not even stated, doesn't have to be, it's just assumed. That's not neutrality. Right. And so once we get past this idea that journalism has to be neutral, we start to get to the idea that journalism is always invested on one level or another. We just chose our investments, right? Meaning that we're unabashedly anarchists, right? Not autonomists, not any, like we are anarchists, right? And we cover everything from that perspective. So what that means to us is that we cover things from a position of combativeness and strategy. Right. So if you look at a lot of what we talk about on our podcast or a lot of what we publish on the site, what we're getting into are the political conditions that people exist in, the ways that they're responding to those, right? These are all strategic discussions. Those aren't discussions that would happen in other forms of media outside of IGD or counter-info sites. And so having that space where that combativeness can start to reach a world outside of itself is really important. And so what that means is that we can't do some things, unfortunately. We can't publish communiques directly. We can't get communiques sent to us, largely because we have a lot of exposure and get targeted by the state and things like that. And so we don't want grand jury subpoenas, but we will absolutely write an article about the communique that some counter-info site published. Like no problem at all, because we want people to know about those things. And so it's a complicated project that sort of evolved its positionality over a number of years. But yeah, kind of exists sort of slightly askew to other kind of more traditional counter-info projects.
I think that idea of how much to engage with mainstream journalism is something that, especially during this neo-fascist period of our political climate, is something trans youth are really grappling with. Like, The
Yeah.
trans teens I know talk a lot about this. You know, there will always be those mainstream opportunities for trans youth. There will always be some journalistic outlet that very much wants to interview trans kids to show that
Hmm.
they support trans kids. But realistically, it'll be about the parents. There will
Yeah.
always be school essays that are really mainstream.
Yep.
And I feel like there comes a decision for anarchist trans youth about how much we want to engage with that and how
Hmm.
much we want to be conflictual. Like,
Hmm.
I started a school GSA, I admit it, but it's explicitly anarchist and
Hmm.
always will be.
Hmm.
I've done some of those interviews, but I always bring in an anarchist standpoint, and as a
Right.
result, I'll never be the trans youth who's, out there with the Protect Trans Kids slogan repping the
Uh-huh.
human rights campaign. And I feel like counter-info projects and anarchist journalism have had to do the same thing. Like you're
Oh
in a
yeah.
space where you can conceivably engage with that respectability, but how do you do that or not while maintaining your anarchist principles?
Yeah.
And
We go back to a thing Abby Hoffman said. So Abby Hoffman, the yippie from the 1960s, used to always say that whenever a journalist talks to you, you're the thing that they need. You are the story. They have nothing without you. And so you can make demands, right? If you decide to engage with the press, only do it from that perspective, right? Never do it on their terms because they won't respect your anonymity. They won't respect your security. And so what you have to make it really, really clear to them is that without you, they have nothing. And that if they want to get background information, if they want to get a quote, they're going to have to do it under X, Y, or Z conditions. And if they don't, then have a nice day, right?
I love that. And I feel like so many trans youth and teens need to hear that because I've met so many trans youth who have, been filmed at a protest without their consent and
Yeah,
it's ended up on YouTube, or
yeah,
who've been quoted in an article that they didn't even know existed. And I feel like we advocate every day for our names, for our pronouns, for our needs around gender, and we need to advocate for our security culture the same way because that too is crucial to whether our identity is respected.
absolutely, absolutely.
I was wondering on that note how you define youth liberationist media. Like, would you say it's inherently youth liberationist to create media? And like, how do you make space for youth
Mm,
liberation at its going down? Like, how do you help
mm,
teenagers feel safe to submit their work? If a teenager listening to this podcast wants to submit their work, how can they do that?
yeah, that's a fascinating question. I think I have a somewhat complicated relationship to this question in that when I was a teenager, I think creating media felt really liberatory because you couldn't, right? There was no way to access that. And so once you got, some scissors and some tape and a photocopier, you could make a Z, and the ability to do that was really mind blowing for a lot of us at the time because all of a sudden the range of perspective that existed broadened really dramatically. Because all of a sudden, all of these people had access to publishing, right? When we started watching the earlier forms of kind of this iteration of the internet emerge, we saw blogs and things like that. And those had these kind of really powerful impacts on things like the Arab Spring movements and things like that. Because again, people could get news out in ways that was unmediated, that was impossible to get out any other way. But I think what's happened since then is that so much of quote radical media has become co-opted, right? The language of, empowerment in relation to publication is used by Facebook, right? And so we have to be incredibly careful when we're starting to talk about media today. I think that there's a lot of space for liberatory media. I think what you're doing is really amazing. It's the first project I know of like this, and I'm thrilled it exists.
That's
Uh,
awesome. Thank you.
I made a record of my hand. I put it through the wall. I made a fist and not a plan. Call me a reckless wrecking ball. I threw my blades against the wall and give it all I got. I aim to break not one but all. I'm just a big wrecking ball. I am unruly in the stands. I am a rock on top of the sand.
I'm sure there have been other youth liberationist media projects. Like I'm really drawing heavily on Ayana Goodfellow's work and on
Mm-hmm.
so many badass young anarchists who are out there making media. But I would say that this is the first on Channel Zero network, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
so psyched to be a part of that.
And so, I mean, I would say the same thing that, I was saying when I was talking about anarchist media, in that if you're going to engage in media work of any kind, whether that's talking to the press, whether that's making a zine, whether that's doing a podcast, you have to do it without compromise, right? So if you're doing youth liberationist media, you have to do youth liberationist media and not mediated through adults, right? And that's going to mean a number of things. Like one, that's going to mean having to learn a lot of things, right? That unfortunately, a lot of these spaces are dominated by adults. Most of the spaces that you can learn in are dominated by adults. And so my generation's reaction to that was DIY, essentially, right? We just went out and learned how to do things on our own. That ability to print, to write code, to run your own websites, like all of this stuff, when we use it in an uncompromising way, it can be very liberatory. If we don't use it in an uncompromising way, if we allow terms of service, or if we allow the ownership of a platform to fundamentally shape the way we're engaging, what we're doing is we're engaging within those terms, right? And again, this brings us back to that complication of how much do we engage with media? And I don't think it's a simple binary, right? I think what we have to do, okay, so when Little Black Cart, when LBC Books existed, I wrote for them. And one of the things that we used to talk a lot about before publishing any project was why we were doing it, right? Writing in itself, media in itself doesn't mean anything, right? I mean, we can see the Harris campaign is really good at media and it means literally nothing, right? It is contentless. Doing just media in itself without a purpose can be, really deeply grounded in sort of capitalist individualism. You see that with influencer culture. But if you are able to do it without those compromises, or if you're able to navigate those compromises, if you're able to look at your strategic goal for why you're doing this and be able to evaluate the terrains that you are operating in, whether that terrain is a street or a neighborhood or Twitter, we can make strategic decisions based on what we think is going to get us closer to our goal. Right. And so whenever we're doing a media project, we have to think about media projects just like any other kind of action, right? They're going to have impacts on the world. And that's the whole point. And so what we need to do is we need to try and impact the world in the ways that we're looking to impact the world, right? And what that often means in media is creating your own outlets, creating your own podcasts, running your own zines. Locally, there were a group of kids that were running a newspaper, like printed on newsprint. It was really cool. Those kinds of things can be incredibly powerful. I think what we have to be cautious of a little bit, and we talk about this on the IGD podcast a lot, is that we can't allow media to substitute for our relationships. And one of the things that does happen in a media saturated environment like this is that it's really easy to sort of commodify, or to use the situationist terminology, spectacularize almost anything at this point. And so as we're kind of engaging in these spaces, we have to be incredibly aware of the ways that we're kind of interacting with things that exist outside of this. And we have to be incredibly aware of what our goals are. Otherwise, we're just sort of contributing noise to the media landscape, right? But yeah, I mean, like I said, I think this project is really awesome. I think you all are doing a really amazing job doing this kind of media, right? Doing this kind of uncompromising media.
That is so meaningful to hear. And I love the idea that media needs to be intentional and explicitly political.
Mhm.
Like, there are some, going back to like the analogy of like trans youth identity as counter info, there are
Mhm.
so many blogs and podcasts and YouTube channels and Twitter accounts out there about trans youth issues, most of which are by cis adults. So
Yeah.
maybe miss the point a little bit. And I think it's so necessary to have trans youth media that isn't just about raising awareness,
Yeah.
but about an explicit political goal. And for the child and enemies, that's bashback influence queer and trans anarchism. And for so many trans youth, that's, like trans liberationist ideas. And
Yeah.
People are already aware of queerness. There has
Mhm.
always been queerness, and I think going beyond that is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I mean
So I'm wondering,
that's what Bashback was about, right? I mean, I was involved in that. A lot of people my generation were.
a
Um,
lot of people still are.
a lot of people still are. Yeah, I mean, and this kind of
Bashback
first,
Midwest Regionals are coming up in a couple months. Just a shout out.
yeah, which is really, people should go to that. It's really exciting. Yeah, I mean, like this first generation Bashback from 2008 and 9 was so much about forcing people to have space. Right? Like one of the biggest actions that they did was they raided the HRC benefit in Washington, D.C., because HRC was super turfy at the time. And they were forcing themselves into the space. Like what they were saying in that intervention was, we're not trying to force ourselves into your benefit. We're trying to destroy your benefit, but we're trying to destroy your benefit so we can have space in the world because you're not allowing us to have that. They raided a megachurch in Utah. In the middle of a service at some point, right? There was a lot of action against Fred Phelps and kind of the sort of homophobic preacher phenomena that existed, that still exists, unfortunately. But yeah, so much of Bashback originally was about this idea that queer people, queer youth were disappeared, not just outside of movement spaces, but inside of movement spaces as well. And that if you wanted to in any way be an accomplice to people that were experiencing that, that meant really stepping up and forcing those spaces open. And that happened through direct action, right? Incredibly effective direct action. There's a really interesting book. I'm sure you're very aware of it, but for your listeners, there's a book called Queer Ultraviolence.
Oh my God, I love that book. That was the
amazing.
first thing I read that basically helped me transition. So yeah.
Yes, Queer Ultraviolence is sort of, I would say, kind of the anthology or archive of that first generation of Bashback. And anyone that's getting involved in Bashback today, I really encourage you to go back and look at what that looked like 10 or 15 years ago, right? Because it did look different, but on a lot of levels, the objectives were similar, even though I think the way it manifests looks different just because it's a different time now.
I'd say current Bashback is a lot more mutual aid oriented, and
That's
it's a lot more about building translocal networks of care.
Mhm.
Like it seems that in the past it was you'd have a Bashback chapter in your city and maybe you'd go do a regional convergence. And now, as someone in the Bashback tendency, I know people involved in Bashback all over the so-called US, and it's huge in the Great Lakes region, of course, and in that community, I'd say there's a lot more awareness of it than elsewhere.
That's great.
But I think the boundaries of what insurrectionary anarchism has really expanded. And among my generation, there isn't really this division of insurrectionary or prefigurative. I tend to answer the question, "Are you insurrectionary or prefigurative?" with "I'm non-binary." But, but really, they are the same thing if you look at it. So. Yeah. On that topic, I'm wondering, what is IGD up to these days, either related to the Bashback tendency, related to regionals, in terms of your organizing in general? Is there anything you'd like to plug or any calls to action that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, what we're up to now is we're focusing on, we're about to put out the 200th episode of This Is America. Which was kind of shocking when we realized we put out 200 episodes of one of the two podcasts we've done. So there's a lot of material there. If any of you are interested in that, you can feel free to go dive into the archives. Everything's up on archive.org. We did a really wonderful interview with Vicky Osterweil recently. That would really encourage. So Vicky Osterweil, for those of you that are not aware.
I interviewed her last episode.
Yeah, Vicky's great. Wrote In Defense of Looting, which is one of my favorite books of the last 5 or 6 years. But we had a really wonderful discussion with Vicky, and I really encourage people to listen to it. Yeah, it was really fun. We have one coming up with the guy behind the Not Bored Scene, which is a situations project from the 90s. We have him coming up on the next episode. So yeah, we've got some interesting stuff happening. If people want to send us stories, please do. God, please send us things at info@itsgoingdown.org. We used to have an open publication page on our website, and I'm sure you can all imagine what happened with that. We filtered through many hundreds of pages of death threats and things like that before we got to an actual article. So please email us any report backs, anything. I would love for someone to write a report back about the upcoming bashback convergence, for example. That would be amazing. Otherwise, I really encourage people to, we're at this time in American anarchism where for the first time, we really have intergenerationality in the modern era. Like when I was getting involved, everybody was young, right? Like everybody. 16, 17 years old was really normal. During the anti-war movement, like most organizers were 20. We didn't have anybody to learn from. We didn't have anybody to challenge. We didn't have anybody to, ask questions to or get questions asked to us from, right? We didn't have that. The side effect of that was that a lot of us experienced a lot of trauma. A lot of us went to jail, right? A lot of us ended up with permanent injuries because we were experimenting, and sometimes those didn't work. Nobody needs to go through that anymore, right? Get your communities together. Get youth communities together. Get together with older folks. Like really figure out ways for that discourse to happen between the people that are younger and getting involved today and people that might have been around for 20 years. That discourse is absolutely crucial. And I think, unfortunately, those older of us tend to not listen to younger people. So for older of us that are out there listening, I'm 41, right? Listen to younger people. They know a lot more things than you think, than you anticipate, right? They're going to give you perspectives we're never going to have. And they're critical, right? We need to listen to younger people. For younger people that are out there, go find your elders in your community because they exist now, right? Go learn things from them. Go learn operational security from your community's resident hacker, right? Because almost every community has one. But really get into the world of anarchism in America, not the online communities, but get into the world of anarchism in America as much as you can. It's a lived phenomenon, right? It's a body of theory, sure. It's a history, of course, but it's a lived phenomenon that manifests most effectively when we are living combatively, right? And that's done better and safer when you're doing it with other people. And so really go out and help build that intergenerationality. I think it's probably one of the most important things we can be doing right now.
Thank you so much for sharing your youth liberation journey. I'm MK Zariel. This has been Tom from It's Going Down, and you're listening to The Child and Its Enemies.